When John Brown left Kansas, he moved back to Massachusetts. And interestingly, the church that he joined when he moved back to Massachusetts was an abolitionist church, whole congregation. And over the course of his membership, the church had invited Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass both to come and address the congregation. So John Brown got to personally meet these two characters who were very famous in American history. Now, as he listened to Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, and later he was going to meet Harriet Tubman, a plan began to develop in his mind. What he really wanted to do, and he thought God had called him to do this, was to create a brand new state. Now, where he was going to put his state was probably going to be what we call West Virginia today. But he was going to get a detachment of freed slaves and form like a militia army that he was going to command. And what he wanted to do was take this army into Virginia and go down the roads and buy the plantations, and as they came to a plantation, issue a call for the slaves that were on the plantation to put their plows down and to join him in the revolution. Now, slave owners are not just going to let slaves walk off the plantation, so John Brown understood that he was going to have to be able to use force. And this is where another part of his plan comes in. In order to be able to establish a new state full of abolitionists and freed slaves, he was going to have some ammunition as well as troops. There was an arsenal or an armory, I don't know if you're familiar with either one of those terms or not, located in Harper's Ferry, Virginia at the time. In West Virginia now, but West Virginia didn't exist at that time. An armory or an arsenal is where the government stores weapons and ammunition. And it was said that in the armory at Harper's Ferry, there was 100,000 rifles. So here's the plan. John Brown says, A, I'm going to get some troops together, and B, we're going to go to Harper's Ferry and we're going to take the arsenal. And once we take the arsenal, we'll have plenty of weapons to distribute to any of the slaves that we're able to free. The more slaves that we free, the more rifles we'll give out, the more power we'll have. And eventually what we're going to do is we'll free all of the slaves. And when all of the slaves have been freed, the Southern economy is going to collapse. Slavery will be dead, and we will be past the worst incidents of human abuse in American history. Sound like a pretty cool plan. Sound like a pretty ambitious plan, forming a state, taking a federal arsenal, and freeing thousands of slaves. Sound like a great plan. So he took his plan to William Lloyd Garrison. You remember William Lloyd Garrison, you've already read about him. He was a newspaper man, big abolitionist. Thought for sure that William Lloyd Garrison would say, yes, that's a great plan. But William Lloyd Garrison says, man, this is crazy. You can't do that. So he went to Frederick Douglass, who he had met at church and formed a friendship with. And he explained his plan to Frederick Douglass. Douglass says, like Garrison, says, man, you can't do that. That's not going to work. You're going to make matters worse instead of better. That will never happen. Then he went to Harriet Tubman. And she says, yes, that sounds like a plan that I can agree with. So her part was to recruit freed slaves on the front end. And there were a lot of freed slaves that lived in the North. Harriet Tubman knew a lot of them because she'd helped some of them get to their freedom. So she says, how many troops you want? John Brown says, 4,500 ought to do. So she says, okay, I'll see what I can do. Well, in the meantime, Frederick Douglass was so opposed to what John Brown was planning that everything that Harriet Tubman did to recruit freed slaves Frederick Douglass undid, telling them how crazy the plan was, and all it was going to do was get them killed. So we're going to shorten this story again. It comes time to make the raid on Harper's Ferry. He wanted 4,500 troops. You know how many he wound up with? That's right, 21. 16 of them were white abolitionists, and only 5 of them were freed slaves. So he's got these 21 men. His plan is to go and take the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. So they arrive at Harper's Ferry late in the afternoon. Oh, everything okay with that? Uh-oh, we're having technical difficulties, sorry. He arrives late in the afternoon, and when they get to the arsenal, much to their pleasant surprise, there's only one guard. I mean, you got a whole arsenal there with 100,000 rifles and ammunition. The United States government only had one guard to take care of the place. And so they just walk in and they take whatever they want. Well, John Brown, being the smart guy that he was, made sure that the telegraph lines in the town were cut so that nobody could get a message out about what was going on. But about the time they took the arsenal, there was a railroad that ran through the arsenal, and here comes a B&O train. And when it gets to the arsenal, they stop the train and they question the engineer, and the engineer questions them, and the guy driving the train figures out that there's something wrong. So what John Brown should have done, he should have never let that train pass through. But in a few minutes, they let that train go. So when the train gets to the next station where there's a telegraph line where the lines have not been cut, they send a telegraph to Washington saying that the arsenal has been invaded by a bunch of wild abolitionists. You better send help. Well, by this time it's night. But the word gets out. And early the next morning in Washington, somebody makes the decision to send a detachment of Marines to Harper's Ferry to make sure that everything is okay. Interestingly enough, the commander of that detachment of Marines is named Robert E. Lee. And one of his sub-commanders is named Jeb Stuart. Those are 2 names that are going to be extremely famous for their roles in the Civil War. That night, though, there were a lot of local people who found out what was going on at Harper's Ferry. So a bunch of the men got together and they surrounded the arsenal. These were just farmers and regular volunteer people, men who brought their guns. So they surrounded the arsenal, and there was one avenue of escape that could have been used for John Brown to get he and his men out safely. But the militia figured it out, and they blocked his escape route. So early the next morning, Brown called his men all in to a blockhouse made out of brick and concrete block that stood at the front of the arsenal. And he called all of his men in there, and they barricaded themselves inside the house, locked the door. He said that they cut holes in the side walls so that his men could stick their rifles out and shoot at people that were trying to flush them out. But about shortly after sunup, this detachment of Marines arrives, and Brown says, "We're toast now. We have been had." But Robert E. Lee was kind enough to give him an opportunity to surrender. He sends Jeb Stuart with under a white flag, knocks on the door. Don't worry about Nellie. That's not Chewy. Don't blame us, Chewy. They knock on the door. They communicate with Stuart. Stuart says, "Guys, you got a chance to surrender. We'll spare your life if you'll just come out." Brown says, "I'd rather die fighting." It's okay, have it your way. Well, unknown to John Brown, the Marines had brought a battering ram. So they took that battering ram, in about 30 seconds they had knocked that door down. And everybody inside the arsenal was captured, John Brown included. Now, I don't know what happened to the rest, but let me tell you what happened to John Brown. Shortly thereafter, he was accused of treason and a murder because some people had been killed in the raid, some locals. So they conducted a trial in the county seat where Harper's Ferry was located. Trial lasted for a week, and he did have some good lawyers. And they tried to defend him against the charge of treason. His lawyers said, "How are you going to charge him with treason? What did he do that's treasonous?" But he was convicted anyway because it was Virginia. Virginia was a slave state. That county was a slave county. John Brown was an abolitionist who had attempted a slave insurrection. So of course they're going to call him guilty. And when they name him or pronounce him guilty, they sentence him to hang. But not just to hang, but they're going to hang him publicly. And they specify the time and the place. A month later, they're going to hang him where anybody and everybody that wants to see can come and watch. So now he's in jail waiting to be hung. They try to be nice to him. They offer him religious counsel. They tell him that they'll send some pastors and stuff in if he wants to talk to them. Every time John Brown would reject that, he said, "I'm not about to talk to a counselor or to a pastor that supports slavery. Anybody that supports slavery can't possibly be who I want to talk to about my spiritual problems." And so he rejected all of that. He wrote letters. He at one time had an opportunity to break out because he had formed a friendship with one of the men in his guard. He told the guy, he says, "Look, I know you'd break me out and I appreciate it, but says, I'm so old I don't want to spend the rest of my life running from the federal government." He says, "I'm too old for that." He says, I'll just hang. If that's what they want me to do, I'll just hang." And that's what they wanted. And ultimately, that's what happened. During that month when John Brown was in prison waiting to be hung, several interesting things happened. First of all, his name became very, very popular among abolitionists of the North, and he became a major villain for people in the South. But whether you liked him or disliked him, everybody knew the name John Brown. And in that month before he was hung, the authorities at Harper's Ferry were worried that somebody, maybe from the South, would come in and kill him, or somebody from the North would come in and try to break him out. And so they began to quarantine the town, and not that they didn't have COVID-19 either, by the way. They tried to keep everybody out of the town to make sure that the hanging would go off without problems. So the guy who was put in charge of guarding John Brown was named Thomas Jackson, who would become famous himself in just a couple of years when he earned the nickname Stonewall Jackson. Interesting. Also, during this month, there was an American writer named Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was very famous, not only in the United States, but in Europe. Emerson got interested in John Brown, and he began to write essays about him. And at one point, he wrote an essay in which he said, "John Brown is going to make the gallows as famous as Jesus did the cross." Emerson was an atheist, by the way, because Christian wouldn't have said that. But the time passed, the month passed, and they got ready to hang John Brown. His wife had a last meal with him. He wrote a letter to some of his family. They came to get him. They walked him to the gallows, and they asked him for his last words. And I can't quote exactly what he said, but I'll paraphrase it. He said, "I'm about ready to die. I thought I could save or spare the United States the horrors of war. but I wasn't able to do it. He said, now the only way that the sin of slavery is going to be washed away is with blood. And that turned out to be a prophecy, because in less than 2 years after he was hung, the Civil War would begin. And in that Civil War, there was almost 625,000 young men from both the North and the South that would die. And so his prophecy about blood proved absolutely accurate. When John Brown died, after he had been pronounced dead, they put his body on a train, and they were going to send it back to New York to where some of his family lived, and they were going to bury him. Their plan was to stop in Philadelphia to get his body embalmed. But there were so many people in Philadelphia crowding the tracks that they were afraid to stop the train. So they carried his body on to New York. He was buried. You can still go and see the burial place today. I think the tombstone may be encased in plastic or something. He's a very famous man, but what he did was so noteworthy and so inspiring to abolitionists. It was so vile to Southerners and so scary that Southerners began to greatly fear, a slave insurrection. And so as time passed, the South wanted less and less to do with the North, not just because of John Brown, but in part, John Brown had a great role to play in starting the Civil War because of what he did. John Brown goes down in history as a strange character. It's up to everybody to decide whether or not he actually was trying to do God's will, if what he did was viewed by God as right or wrong. In fact, whether it was right or wrong is viewed by people. It's an interesting question. He's an interesting character. But the people that called him mad and crazy had him all wrong, because he was anything but that. He was a very intelligent character. Now I want to close with just one other bit of information that I find interesting as we look at the causes of the Civil War. There's one other thing that happened in Kansas and Missouri that's interesting. Another interesting character whose name is William Quantrill. I have seen William Quantrill portrayed in Hollywood movies on numerous occasions. He's always portrayed as a villain, and in his case, portraying him as a villain would be absolutely correct. William Quantrill organized a raid on Lawrence, Kansas. This was after the sack of Lawrence that I told you about earlier. During the war, he organized the sack of Lawrence, Kansas, which he gathered together about 450 people who were angry and who were pro-slave and who didn't like what was going on and who hated the idea that the South was getting beat. They went into Lawrence, Kansas early one morning, and they killed 150 men and boys, just basically in cold blood. Most of them weren't even armed. They burnt the town and went on about their merry way. In the group that William Quantrill took to Lawrence was a fellow by the name of Frank James and his brother Jesse. I heard of Jesse James? Cole Younger was in the group. And interestingly, William Quantrill, this scalawag, this vile person, trained most of the criminals who made a name for themselves out west after the Civil War. The days of the train robberies and cattle rustling, a lot of that can be traced back to William Quantrill. So Kansas was not a good place to be during the 1850s and 1860s. It's a good place now, though. I know several people from Kansas been there, but it's part of history. Folks, be sure and read your material. This coming week, I want you to read about the war itself. There will be some questions that you'll need to answer, but read the material and I will try to make one more video. We'll talk a little bit about some things of interest to the Civil War that's not in your book. Stay safe. Have a good day. See you later.